Right. And let's go with, on this next question then, name 2 television shows that you felt had both the financial and critical success, or basically something that you really enjoyed and like to talk about.
Yeah, well, The Rockford Files was one I thought that did both. And in that show, you had, to me, the writing was actually good in the show, but it also made a lot of money and it was very popular. So, I mean, yes, you can do both, and that's a good example of a show that did do both. You know, I said this about the Rockford Files. I said it before. It's my personal favorite show of all time, and I thought the writing in it was as good as Alex Haley's Roots, which is not faint praise by any stretch of the imagination. But you had interesting plot lines, you had interesting three-dimensional characters, and you had a hero who was not that heroic. I mean, he was basically a decent person. He's basically admirable qualities, but he had a lot of rough edges too. You know, so he wasn't all good. He wasn't all bad. He was a complex, interesting character. And you know, the character of James Rockford, played by James Garner, I think really just nailed. You know, I think it just all came together right, the way a TV show should.
Yeah. Let's get back to another, and I'm going to phrase this here. Got my notes right here. So I'm going to have to read this one here. This one out. The diamond is the strongest crystal because it has the simplest base. We can all agree on that. But you say that writing should start out with a simple idea and then get more complicated. Yeah. That's a good analogy. Explain that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a mistake a lot of writers make, and artists in general too. Whereas I think, you look at in my opinion, some of the best films, and the best writing, there were really fairly simple stories. I mean, Tokyo Story. It's basically a story about this elderly couple who goes to visit their children who they haven't seen in years and years, and them and their children have grown apart. And they visit their children are rude to them, they don't like the experience, and they leave to go back home early. And that's the whole plot of the movie, and it's listed as one of the 10 best films of all time in many people's list, and I would agree with that. It's a great movie, it's a classic. But the thing is it starts with a very simple premise about how things sometimes fall apart. And it just goes from that premise, building on more of those details based on that very simple premise. And the problem a lot of writers and storytellers and filmmakers get into is they try to get into these convoluted, complex plots. And it's like, okay, but where's the weenie? Where's the beef? where's the moral of the story? What can we learn, from this? Or is it just excitement and sensationalism for 2 hours, and then we roll the credits and hopefully they don't figure out that they've just been sold a bill of goods?
Right, and with some of the classic movies that you've mentioned before, the characters make some of this classic. A couple of them we've mentioned before, Seven Samurai, Gone with the Wind. These characters bring something. Tell us about that. Tell us how that can...
Well, character is very important in story. Amazingly, a lot of writers seem to forget having interesting three-dimensional complex characters, how important that is to a story. And you look at a character like Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, and she's basically not a very sympathetic or likable person, but she has a lot of strength to her that gets her through these crises. And it's the fact that she is so narcissistic. It's the fact that she is so ruthless. It's the fact that she, all these qualities that might be considered bad qualities in a person is what allows her to survive this tragedy of the Civil War and allows her to prosper and raise her family as a result of that. And to me, that was an interesting story, but the story is based, once you come up with a premise, you have to come up with the character to go with that premise. And, in Gone with the Wind, they did both brilliantly. The basic premise of the waste of the Civil War, the tragedy of the Civil War, and once these people experienced this tragedy, what they had to do to survive and prosper after this horrible experience. To me, a lot of people say Gone with the Wind, there's this Gone with the Wind backlash. They say, okay, it wasn't that good of a film, really. it wasn't really a classic. I disagree with that. I think it was one of the best movies ever made. I would put it way ahead of Citizen Kane. I would put it way ahead of Pulp Fiction. Or a lot of these other movies that people are, don't get me wrong, I love Pulp Fiction. Citizen it is considered a classic, and I did like the movie. I didn't love it, but I did like it. I did respect it. It's a film to watch, to study, definitely. But my main problem with Citizen Kane, like I said before, is I think it's just been too ripped off. It's just been too imitated.
Right. Now, let's go to another movie here, and I think this kind of goes to like one of the first questions. Dick Tracy, the movie, you felt that it was melodramatic, but the movie had momentum, character development, characters you could root for, and strong actors, and excellent production.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Dick Tracy to me was an interesting case of kind of a thin plot line and kind of a thin premise that was really pretty fun. It was a really pretty fun film, and added by the fact that they had this makeup with all these characters with these like big faces. That was kind of quirky and unique for a movie. We hadn't really seen that anything think of before. It had very good production values, very strong actors, and while the writing was not particularly daring, innovative, original, and even though the movie was kind of melodramatic, whereas Dick Tracy's pretty much a straight shooter as a character. He's a guy who's going to uphold the law, and these are the bad guys, these gangsters, and he's going to smash them and protect the good people from these bad, predators and parasites. Even though the movie is very melodramatic, and even though it's really kind of a story of good versus evil, it's also an example of a melodramatic film that really works. It's one of the few examples. And part of it, I think, has to do with the strong directing by Warren Beatty. I believe he was the director on that. And also the strong acting by all the principals in that film. Right.
And
it just clicked. It just worked. And I think a lot of it worked because it had good momentum. And you're kind of rooting for Dick Tracy. Because he does things that are kind of sympathetic to this young kid and tries to see that he goes right, and he tries to set the right example as he considers the right example to be. I mean, it's a pretty melodramatic movie, but at the same time, it was just a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, there's also examples in movies of underdeveloped characters in some movies, but strong actors or supporting actors that can kind of pull that off. I think in third installment, I think you know what supporting actor I'm talking about.
John Malkovich.
That's right.
Because I look at the movie Rounders, where he plays a guy named KGB in the film, and the character, in my opinion, wasn't very well flushed out as a person. But Malkovich, he was able to, through his performance, put a dimension into that character that wasn't in the writing.
Right.
That's why I list him as my personal favorite, and probably, in my opinion, the best well-known actor in this country. And I'm using the definition well-known, because, there are really great actors out there, but, it's like not very many of them are on John Malkovich's plateau.
That's right.
Yeah.
And, now...
We're talking the best of the best of the best here,